You're listening to Now It's the News. I'm Beowulf Rockland. If you've been paying any attention to the news, you understand that we are a very divided nation. It's not just the last couple of years under the Trump administration. It's been something that has been happening with frightening regularity, a divided, a partisan nation with very different ideas about how to proceed, and less and less overlap, it seems, between the two major parties and an independent middle that seems to be shrinking a little bit more every year. A lot of folks are examining this issue, and two of the best are with me now. Kevin Kruse and Julian Zelizer. They are the authors of Fault Lines, A History of the United States Since 1974. Kevin, Julian, welcome to Now It's the News. Thank you for being here today.
Thanks for having us.
Sure thing. So you mark 1974 as a particularly important date in when it comes to beginning this process, beginning this sort of bifurcation of American politics. I know others have put it perhaps at the Gingrich revolution in the mid-1990s. What is it about 1974 that seems to mark the beginning of this process for you?
Well, two things. One, 1974 is really a moment when there is a real fracture with the post-war order. A lot of stuff happens that year and the years around it, if you think about the kind of big events. The big one in 74, of course, is Richard Nixon's resignation from the presidency, an incredible shock to the political system. But all the other structures of America's kind of seemingly stable post-war world really got rattled about the same time. So the economy takes a beating with the oil crisis of 1973, the oil embargo, and the start really of what becomes to be the stagflation of the 1970s. America's foreign policy prestige is shattered by the withdrawal of American troops from Vietnam and the feeling that was a misadventure and all the distrust it caused at home. There's Roe v. Wade in 1973. There's a lot that goes on in that period that really does shake things up to a considerable degree. Gingrich is a huge part of our story. He's probably one of the central figures, and in terms of the partisanship and polarization that we feel today, he's certainly an influential figure there. But we're historians, so we take a slightly longer view, and we wanted to show how these things didn't come out of nowhere in 94 or even today, but really were several decades in the making.
Do you suppose that in a sort of shallow political sense, Republicans were waiting for the opportunity to sort of, I suppose, get revenge and take down their own president in a way, and that's some of the impetus that drove the Congress to impeach President Clinton in 1998. Was that just kind of an explosion waiting to happen that kind of came out of the cultural divide of the late 1960s, early 1970s? The first blood was taken with the resignation of President Nixon in 1974, and from that point on, we were sort of, especially with Bill Clinton representing, as he did, that younger generation, that baby boomer generation who had protested in the 1960s. Was that just a target waiting to happen?
There's something to that. I mean, there is a way to think of the attempt to remove President Clinton through the impeachment process as, this is getting back for Watergate. This is the Democratic Watergate. But I think more pertinent and was the logic and power of partisanship as it was unfolding over a series of battles in the 1980s and 90s. Gingrich and other Republicans step into a landscape which had really been shattered and unsettled by all the crises of the 1970s and introduced a much more aggressive style of governance and partisanship that was being fought out well before President Clinton is in office. We talk about the 1988 campaign where George W. Bush, H.W. Bush, the vice president, kind of model of the establishment brings Lee Atwater into the campaign and runs a really tough attack on Dukakis. So these battles were brewing, and then I think they manifested themselves with Clinton, but it was more than just payback for Richard Nixon. In many ways, it was just almost inevitable, the inevitable direction of where these partisan battles were going to go.
That's the voice of Julian Zelizer. He and Kevin Kruse are our guests today. They're the authors of Fault Lines, A History of the United States Since 1974. How does the media play into this as we see the advent of 24-hour cable news at this same time that you're talking about in the late 1980s, early 1990s? I know that my first memories of watching CNN were during the first Gulf War and seeing those reports. And while it had a great ability to bring us images from around the world, it also had a great ability to amplify the arguments internally. How does the news cycle and the media political consultancy regime, so to speak, play into this increasingly divided nation politically that we have, especially as we move into the era of the Internet?
It's hugely important, and that's one of the things we really spend a lot of time on in the book. You know, the fault lines of the title aren't just the kind of the lines that divide us in terms of politics, economics, race, and gender, but also the lines we're fed about who's at fault. And so the media really does shape a lot of our perceptions today. And the transformation of this period is one that's really remarkable. If you look back to 1974, you've basically got a pretty coherent establishment media. You've got the big three news network, the TV networks. You've got a few major newspapers. That's really it that sets the pace for the country. Over the course of this period, though, you really do see a proliferation of an incredible new number of media outlets, and cable is certainly one that really transforms this. And so it can both bring the world together, and as you note, the Gulf War, the first Gulf War, is really when CNN really kind of comes out and makes its name. You know, it had been around since 1980, but in the Gulf War, it becomes internationally known. You know, George H.W. Bush, the president, says he watches CNN rather than listen to the CIA because he gets news about the war in Iraq faster from CNN. They tell a joke in the Middle East. You know, how many people does it take to fire a Scud missile? 1 to load it, 2 to fire it, 3 to watch CNN and figure out where it landed. Now, at the same time, Fox News, which comes about in 1996, just a little bit later, shows a different side of the cable phenomenon. Unlike CNN, which really tried to play it down the middle because it had an international audience, Fox News increasingly caters to a domestic audience, and particularly to those on the right. And so we see here, beyond the era of network news in which they had tried to play it down the middle, there comes in cable this new phenomenon of what other networks, what MTV had called narrowcasting, of really, instead of reaching out to a huge audience through broadcasting and casting a wide net, you're going to focus in on a certain segment. So for MTV, it was rock fans. For ESPN, it's sports fans. Fox News increasingly becomes, we're going to reach out to conservatives. And so they advance a very clear partisan line, and that becomes more and more the norm for the media as cable multiplies, but as we especially go into the era of the Internet and social media today. And that's where we are.
And with more attention and more eyeballs and ears in the case of especially conservative talk radio, with more folks in those audiences, more and more money goes towards trying to influence the conversation on both sides. And you have, as a consequence, politicians spending more time raising money, and there's only so much time, so less time devoted to the needs of their constituency. It's a vicious cycle, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think it is a big part of the story we want to tell, that the kinds of political divisions, for sure, that we see in this country and we've seen for a while now, are not simply the result of one leader or another. or even one episode like the impeachment causing us to fall apart. The way our institutions work, all the incentives are toward division, and so it brings out the worst of us in some ways, rather than trying to push us toward points of commonality. So the media is one example where the incentives increasingly are for politicians to play to those networks or sites online or social media accounts and to be part of that more divided conversation. And the incentives in other parts of politics, fundraising is a great one, where you'll make the money you need to survive and to campaign if you're loyal to single-issue interest groups. And we trace the history of many of these incentives, really, that emerged during these decades, which explains why we keep recreating the cycle regardless of who's in power. And we're not likely to get out of it until we get back to those roots.
We're speaking with Kevin Kruse and Julian Zelizer. They are the authors of Fault Lines, A History of the United States Since 1974. I guess I would like to follow up on that last statement by asking what hope do we see on the horizon for that kind of going back to those roots? Is there any indication that there is a center, a growing independent movement? Certainly in the 2016 election, I think we saw some crossover from what might have been a traditional Democratic voting bloc in some instances, especially in rural working class America, crossing over, as has been the trend, I suppose, to Donald Trump, even though he did not win the popular vote. But in some key places, that certainly played a big role. We see organizations like the Problem Solvers Caucus, which are composed of both Democrats and Republicans coming together, but they seem to be overshadowed by other more partisan organizations like the Progressive Caucus and the Freedom Caucus on the right. Mm-hmm. What do you see on the horizon that leads you to believe that there could be a breaking of this cycle and a return to a more integrated politics?
Well, I think it's important to remember that, in a lot of ways, our institutions amplify our partisanship, and so you can, if you look to the polling numbers on a lot of these issues today, whether it be gun control or tax rates or things like that, the public is actually largely in favor of a lot of these stuff. We've got institutional incentives that I think drive a lot of people apart. I think it's easy to overstate the power of centrism or moderate solutions, because moderate is kind of a mushy idea that means different things to different people, right? And so it's not kind of a coherent. There's not a coherent centrist identity. There's always an instinct to do that. I do think actually we can see some signs of breaking free of where we are in terms of actually some of the things that are on partisan lines. And so if you look at, say, the movement of the Parkland High students to put gun control measures on the national agenda, that's outside the party structure, and they had the tremendous progress. Or look at what happens with, say, the Me Too movement. That's outside the party structure, but really has been affecting a lot of change. So I think it's odd for two political historians to maybe advance this argument. Maybe Julian would differ, but I think a lot of the hope for progress actually lies outside formal politics, and if that happens, the politicians will follow, because that's where the voters are.
It's interesting because so many of the movements that you talk about there are, as soon as they come about, there's an attempt by the sort of media complex that we've been discussing to categorize them as being specifically political, and I think they, to an extent, they've defied that, but certainly in the case of Parkland and Me Too, I think there has been a certain amount of pushback from the right, and I hope that there is some way of transcending that, because it seems like we rush to our first instincts, whether we are on the left or the right, and we try to put it in a category so that we know where we stand with regard to an increasingly complicated political landscape, and it's gratifying to see that there are certainly these non-governmental, spontaneous organizations that form themselves, but even they are sort of moved and pulled by the gravity of the existing system.
I think that's an important point, and certainly accurate in that when these movements emerge, and they're not, I mean, they often have a